Hello and welcome to An Idol Called Food. I'm your host, JT Tapias, and in today's episode, we're going to be speaking about how to lead yourself so that you can lead others efficiently. This episode is sponsored by EYBPlantFuel.com, supplements that make a significant difference in your life. Let's jump right into it. I want to start off with an Old Testament book called the Book of Hosea. In Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, we have a clear depiction of what a lack of knowledge can actually bring into our lives. The book of Hosea in chapter 4, verse 6 says this: "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will reject you from being a priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children." Yikes. This is speaking directly to Israel and bringing condemnation on Israel because of a lack of knowledge, a lack of vision. It says here that because you have rejected, meaning that there was a choice to accept or to reject, they rejected the precepts of God, they cease to be leaders. They cease to be a priest to God. In other words, a leader to God, a voice piece for God. And since it says here, you have forgotten those precepts, I will also forget your children, meaning that there is this condemnation that is not only coming upon the people, but then the people to come, right? You've heard of the quote that says, a righteous man leaves an inheritance for his kids' kids, meaning that when you are actually faithful with those precepts, when you actually accept knowledge, when you actually have a vision for your life, then in a very positive way that will affect your life and the people to come. And so notice how a lack of knowledge, a lack of vision can actually get us in a lot of trouble. This was my story for the first 31 years of my life. I grew up to two great parents. One I knew well, my mother. She was a professional singer, and she had intentions for a great life. And so she met my dad, who I didn't necessarily get to meet or know very well, but I learned early on that for 3 generations, him and his family had been pharmaceutical reps. They just never went to college, and they didn't have a license to operate as pharmaceutical reps. They were a 3rd-generation mafia family. And so as you can imagine, my dad put my mom through hell and back. And so my mom got tired of all that kind of lifestyle, and she decided in 1979 to migrate to the United States with my 7-year-old daughter and at the time her 1-year-old son, me. And my mother went back to what she knew how to do. She was a professional singer. And so, of course, she went back to singing. And this meant going into a very toxic environment in the New York nightclubs. This was 1981, 1982. Just a little bit of background story. This was a time that was called the Colombian Bonanza, when the Colombian cartels had stormed the United States with cocaine and drugs, and it was a really toxic time in American history. It was disco music and cocaine. Bad combination. As my mom went into this toxic environment, she met people that were in that drug industry, in that illegal drug trafficking industry. And they saw her as a single mom that was raising 2 kids. She was making very little money. And they thought, hey, let's help this lady out. So they brought her into the business. We came in as what you would consider level entry, basically cartel members. And what that meant was that my mom would be a house bank. Obviously, these organizations couldn't house their money in legitimate banks, and so they used homes and they used family like our family to house some of this money. And so my mom grew through the ranks of the cartel. She quickly became very, very successful in doing what she was doing. We went from being a house bank to ultimately, from 1981 to 1982, my mom ran some of the most notorious Colombian cartel crews in New York City. Embarrassing, but true. In 1992, everything came crashing down, and the state of Southern Manhattan indicted my mother for charges. And she decided to flee. She had 2 kids, and she didn't want to leave her kids alone, so she decided to flee. And since being in the cartel means that you can't just opt out whenever you want. It's not like the Boys and Girls Club where you could just raise your hand and say, hey, I'm done. You can't quit your vows, right? These vows are only broken by blood, meaning when death do us part. And so we went back to a very, very troubled country at the time. Colombia was going through some of its worst history. The notorious Pablo Escobar was on the run. Lots of agencies were behind him. There were bombs going off in the city. There were curfews in place. Shootouts consistently happening throughout the city. It was a very, very dangerous place. And so my mom decided that that probably wasn't the best environment for me, and she sent me back to the U.S. She sent me to stay with some friends that she thought I would be safe, but they were also in the same kind of business, and it was very chaotic. And to be honest, at the age of 14, I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. I had lived this life for 14 years now, and I was physically sick and just I had it. And so I stayed with these people for a couple months. And then I decided that I'd be better off on my own. This put me on a very difficult 14-month trajectory of being homeless in the streets of New York. And I learned some of my most important lessons in that time. I learned to be physically hungry and how to actually deal well with physical hunger and all of the interesting things that you learn through physical hunger and having a lack of, right? And having grit and persistence and just becoming gritty and having to grow up very, very, very quickly. It's probably some of the most profitable times of my life. I learned some important lessons in those 14 months. And for the very first time, I had clarity over what I wanted to do and how I wanted to get myself out of this mess. By the grace of God, I had a talent for soccer. I was a very, very good soccer player. And so, of course, I quickly found a team in Flushing Meadows Park, and it was an amateur team, but it was led by some people that had played professionally in Colombia. We had players from all over the world, just great diversity on the team, players from Peru, Brazil, Ecuador, and some of them had played in Division II teams, Division I teams. And so this was a great environment for a young kid just coming up. And so I got to really, really surround myself by people that were at a way higher level than I was. And of course, when that happens, your level also rises, right? And so great moment in time for me to be there. I had tons of clarity. I knew that this is what I wanted to do. I was at Flushing Meadow Park from sun up to sundown, and I learned discipline, right? I learned to really stay consistent and learning so many great pillars, these three amazing pillars that really allowed me to lead myself first. And so I progressed through my soccer career, and I was very, very talented. One day in a soccer tryout, I was approached by a young man who was a scout, and he said, we'd love to take you to Spain for a tryout. Are you available? And I said, let me check my agenda. And of course, I agreed. I jumped on that plane. I landed in the north of Spain in a place called Zaragoza, Spain. I went to a place called La Ciudad Deportiva. This is where the professional team and the amateur teams trained. And within 7 minutes, I got to sign a contract. They wanted me to stay. And so for the next 3 years, I stayed in Zaragoza, and I got to play with some of the people that I admired, some of the people that I had seen on TV. And it was great. It was one of my greatest moments. I still to this day, I think of that as probably one of the highlights of my life. And it was great. But I wasn't there for long. I was only there for 3 years. And then I was asked to go to a team in Mexico, and where I had to try out and, of course, kind of win my way into that team. And so I landed in Guadalajara, Mexico, and I was there for another 2.5 years, and things were going well. I had great opportunities to excel, and things were looking up for me. But, of course, my destiny, once again, came to pass, and I met a girl who was my agent's niece, and quickly fell in love and started to date her and thought that the world was a wonderful place, until one day her uncle, who was my agent, pulled me aside and said, you're a good guy, you're a great player, and I like you. He says, but my niece is not for you. My niece is a medical student, and she's going to marry a doctor and not some womanizing soccer player. And I'm going to ask you nicely to stay away from her. And I didn't think much of the conversation. I said, yes, sir, of course, no problem. Sorry, I didn't mean to be disrespectful. He said, no, I just want to warn you. And I said, okay. But sure enough, I continued to date the girl. One day he showed up to the apartment that was his. He was my agent, and so he had provided a beautiful apartment, and he showed up. It was early in the morning. 3 Tahoes pulled up, just like in the movies. And I heard someone, I was in the second floor. It was kind of a townhouse sort of apartment. And I looked out the window and I saw these 3 Tahoes outside. And I said, oh boy. I saw him walk in and he didn't look happy. And following him were about 7, 8 men who were very scary looking. And he had a key to the place, so he came right in. He went upstairs and I hid under the covers as if the covers were going to protect me from what was about to happen. He walked in the room and he was very, very upset. He told me to get up, smack me over the head, and he told me I had 24 hours to leave the city or else. He was very upset because I had kept dating his daughter. He had found out about it. He had been following us, and he kicked me out of Mexico. And he basically cut my career in half, if not completely. I landed back in the U.S., depressed for 9 months, not understanding what I was going to do with my life, because I thought that soccer was the thing that I was going to do for the rest of my life. And just like 5 other of my family members that played professionally, I would have a great career and I would go on to do great things. But here I was at 23 and my career had been cut in half. And so went back to the States, 9 months of depression. I didn't have passion for anything. I wanted to do nothing. All I knew was soccer. And so after 9 months of just having self-pity, I decided enough is enough, and I started a small gym. I got all my certifications, and once again, I had that clarity that I had with soccer. I had this vision of what I wanted this to be, and I wanted it to be very, very, very different. I worked hard. I applied discipline because now I had clarity. I worked 6 days a week, 60 hours a week, and I poured myself into this 400 square foot tiny facility that all the naysayers kept saying, it's not going to work for you, right? You have 30 gyms in the surrounding areas. They're all bigger. They have greater trainers. They have more experience. They have more credentials. Yeah, you're not going to be successful. But I had clarity and I had discipline, and I was going to be consistent with this vision and this discipline. So I applied those 3 principles of clarity, discipline, and consistency into my business. And guess what? Success came, and success came really, really quickly. Within a year, I had a book of clients worth a high 6-figure income. Money was pouring in from that and another side business that I had started, an entertainment business with kids. And with money came influence, and with influence came toxicity. I was a man of the world. I had no north. I didn't grow up with a dad. I didn't have an example of what it meant to be a man. And so I went out to the world to chase what I thought a man was. And so I chased money. I chased women. I chased all the shiny things I could. And I was very successful in worldly terms. I had everything I had ever desired. But of course, that stuff caught up to me really, really quickly, because with the success, the money, and the influence, and the people you have around you, bad habits start to creep in. And those bad habits for me were alcohol on the weekends, lots of alcohol, drugs to numb my pain. I had a lot of pain from all of the trauma that I had accumulated throughout my years as a child and as an adolescent. And for the very first time, these things were creeping up on me. You see, soccer kept me from a lot of these traumas. At least it kept it dormant. But once soccer wasn't there anymore and alcohol and drugs came into the picture, things got really, really blurry for me. And so, of course, I started to chase all these things. And one day I woke up, I was hungover mentally, physically, and spiritually. I was ready to give up, and I was writing a suicidal letter when I remembered this guy that I would always bump into in the elevator. The guy was good looking, guy who had a beautiful wife, and he and I were contemporary. We were about the same age, yet he seemed like a genuinely happy person. I couldn't deny that he looked happy. There was something very vibrant about him. I couldn't put my finger on it. I didn't know what it was, but he was a happy guy. And I appreciated him. And so every time I bump into him, I would mess with him and I'd invite him to the clubs, but he was coming back from church with a Bible under his arm, and he would always say, you should come to church with me sometime. And I'm like, no way. The typical thing that people that don't go to church say, the walls will cave in and so on and so forth, and make jokes. And so that morning when I woke up hungover mentally, physically, and spiritually, he was the first person that came to mind. So I called him and I said, hey man, I don't think I have another day in me. I don't think I have a couple hours left in me. I'm going to take my life. And he said, whoa, don't do any of that. So he came rushing down. He sat across from me. He told me what God was doing in his life. And of course I pushed back and I said, I don't believe in God. You're going to have to give me something else. And he pressed forward, and as if he were talking about gravity, he said, God is the only thing I have for you. And I said, okay, well, what does that mean? He says, well, what are you doing tonight? I said, I was going to kill myself, but if you have better plans, let's go do that. And I really meant what I was saying. Got in his car reluctantly and went to this big church. This was my first time in an evangelical church, and that pastor that went up that day was speaking about the book of Job and in the Old Testament. And Job was a man who was faithful to God. He had everything any man could ever want. And besides the righteous part, I felt like I resonated with Job's story. And so I looked at my buddy and I said, did you tell the pastor what I have going on? He said, are you kidding me? There's 800 people in here. He's not just speaking to you. He says, this is how God speaks to us. And I said, okay, wow. The sermon was over. I said, that was awesome. Let's go. And he said, no, let's go to the prayer team. I said, prayer what? We went up to this very young guy with an innocent looking face. He looked like he had been brought up in church. He was a cradle Christian. And the young man looked at me and he said, what are we praying for? And I unloaded. And I don't remember a word the man said, but I do remember that I just broke down in tears like never before. I was really surprised because I grew up in an environment where men don't cry, especially in front of other men. And we never asked for help. And here I was, and this guy was praying for me. And so I broke down in tears and I thanked them. I walked away. And as I was walking away, this older man with a very fatherly demeanor came up to me and said, son, why are you crying? And I don't know why that word son hit me so hard. It was this term that I had craved all my life. I wanted to be called a son. I wanted a father to call me a son. And with tears in my eyes, I said, I have no idea, but I'm hurting. And he handed me a Bible. And he handed me that Bible and he said, this is for you. And I said, where do I start? He said, go to the book of John. He said, read the book of John. I said, where is that? So he found the book of John, and I kind of, put a little paper in between just to find it again at some point. And I thanked him. I walked away, and my buddy who was right behind me walked up to him. He happened to know this pastor, and they had a conversation. They exchanged some words that I didn't find out for the next 2 years what that conversation was all about. But he said to my friend, he said, that guy is going to get it. He's going to have clarity. And I don't know what allowed that man to see that in me, because here I was, a mess, all tatted kid who looked nothing like a church-going person, and yet he saw something in me. He saw clarity. He had that clarity that I would get the precepts of God at some point. And sure enough, I walked out of that church. My life radically changed. I progressively got better. I got away from all the vices. I remember looking in the mirror the next day and seeing myself like I had always wanted to see myself. And I no longer saw that shame that accompanied my look into the mirror. And I felt relieved. I felt like a 2,000-pound gorilla had come off my shoulders. And so, as it was usual in my life, when I had clarity, I now knew what to apply my disciplines to. And so I started reading the Bible, and I became an adamant Bible reader. And I devoured the Bible, and I wanted to understand Jesus from a spiritual context, but I also wanted to understand if he was truly a man that walked the earth. So I looked at historical Jesus, and I read Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, and then I went into the culture and the Hebrew culture and why certain things were said. My mind demanded answers, and I dug deep, so deep that I actually gave up my business and went into a 2-year sabbatical so that I could literally study the Word of God and fast and pray And I was asking God to repurpose my gifts to give me clarity and discipline and consistency around these godly principles. I wanted to bring these precepts into my heart. Those 2 years of desert time were some of the most productive years of my life. God quickly allowed me to meet the lady who is my wife today. We've been married for 12 years. He gave me a wife. We dated for 3 months, got married on month 4. In prayer, lots of prayer, he impressed upon my heart the idea that I was to go back into the fitness industry and that I was to be a lighthouse for him. And so he gave me a ministry. Fast forward 12 years, the Lord has given me life and life abundantly. But more importantly, he gave me clarity, the true clarity, which is him. He gave me the disciplines, which is how we actually grow in progressive sanctification. But we need to be disciplined. And then, of course, the consistency of doing it every single day, no matter how stale some of my devotional mornings are, I push through and I still do it. And this story really taught me that a true leader is one who's empowered by the Holy Spirit. We have a lot of leaders out there. We have a lot of thought-provoking people out there that are saying things that make a lot of sense from a rational standpoint, but that some of the people that are really preaching and talking truths, we have a tendency to push back on because it seems so far-fetched, right? But that truly a leader is one who is empowered by the Holy Spirit. And only then can you truly have the correct vision for your life, your ministry, your marriage, and your parenting. The Lord has taught me that the stewardship of the temple is second to godliness. You've probably heard of the verse in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8 that says, "For while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come." Here's what's really interesting. What we have here is not Paul saying, hey, godliness is better than the physical aspect. In essence, he is saying that. He is saying that there is a hierarchy, but this is exactly it. There's a hierarchy of ideas here. He puts one in first place and one in second place, which means that the physical body is second to godliness. We must be good stewards of our temple. We must be transformed from the inside out. The Spirit transforms the physical man. And so I truly believe that the outer self is an expression of the inner disciplines. When you see someone who's happy, genuinely happy, they've encountered intimacy with the Father. Once again, we must lead ourselves first before we can lead others. I want to leave you with this idea. This has been a long episode. My episodes are usually shorter, but I had so much to say to you today, and I wanted to express myself like never before so you can understand the true essence of why this podcast even exists. And so in Galatians chapter 5, verse 24, we see the fruits of the Spirit, right? The reason I bring this up is because when you talk about these very high ideas, the question is, how do I practically bring that into my life? How do I actually make this real for me? How do I technically, inject this into my life? This sounds great, JT, but how do I actually bring this about? Well, here it is. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 24, it says this. In verse 22, it says here, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It says, against such things there is no law. Now, notice here that the first fruit of the Spirit is love, and the last is self-control. I believe that if you don't have love, you can't have joy. If you don't have joy, you can't have peace. If you can't have peace, you can't have patience. If you can't have patience, you can't have kindness. If you can't have kindness, you can't have goodness. And if you can't have goodness, you can't have faithfulness. And if you can't have faithfulness, you can't have gentleness. And if you can't have gentleness, you will not have self-control. Which means that love and self-control are the beginning and the end, and they actually hug all those other fruits of the Spirit and actually bring them to be. And so the first focus is love. You say love to what? In Mark chapter 12, verse 29 through 31, we hear Jesus say this. The most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. Second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. 2 commandments. So it talks about intimacy with the Father. When we have intimacy with the Father, your personal devotional time with God will unleash the other fruits of the Spirit, bringing about self-control. So when you have intimacy, love with the Father, he unleashes love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. You say self-control to do what? Self-control to actually lead yourself first, which in turn allows you to lead others in a way that actually glorifies God. God, that was a mouthful. I know that was a whole lot. I really, really hope that you got something out of this episode. As I usually say, I hope you put it into practice. It has served me tremendously throughout my life to actually have clarity, discipline, and consistency in my life. The true clarity, which is God for me, serving God, glorifying God. And then, of course, the disciplines that are needed to actually grow as a spiritual man, which is prayer, intimacy time with God, fasting, and praying and asking God for direction in our lives. And then being consistent, because your faith walk is not one of feelings. Feelings are involved, but that shouldn't be the thing that propels you to pray, fast. It should be simply the desire to always be there consistently. So discipline and consistency go hand in hand, but you need to have that clarity that comes from God. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. More importantly, I hope that you put it to action. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what you think about this episode, and I look forward to speaking with you guys soon. My name is JT Tapias with an idol called food. I'll talk to you soon. Ciao, ciao.